Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on this week's video. On this week's video, we're continuing with our four-part series on QME Report Writing Mastery. And today's video is part 2 of our four-part series. And what I want to talk to you about today has to do with the required elements of your QME report, and also the proper formatting of your QME report to create impact, to create credibility, to create persuasiveness, and to create opinions and conclusions that are accurate and powerful. Accurate and powerful. So I have a fabulous presentation for you today. And before we get into today's presentation, and before we get to the computer and go through today's topics, I just want to share a couple of general comments with you today. And that is, of all the video trainings that I've published over the past 3 years, it seems that this program, the QME Report Writing Mastery Program, has created the most impact and the most feedback from doctors. Over the past 7 days, since I published part 1 of this 4-part series, I've received so much feedback from doctors that it's fascinating and incredible. And what's fascinating is doctors are, perhaps for the very first time, taking a hard look at their QME reports. They're taking a hard look at their physical examination. They're taking a hard look at the way they're producing their QME reports that up until now they've just considered part of their normal routine and their normal protocols. And because of this series, doctors are making changes to the way they do things, and they're working to improve the content and quality of their final work product, which is their QME report. And I think that's fabulous. I'm so happy. I'm so happy to be getting the feedback from you that I am. You know, many years ago, when I was a new graduate from chiropractic college, I'm a chiropractor, I set a goal for myself, and that goal was to make a major definite impact, in my field, which is the field of chiropractic. And with the changes that the qualified medical evaluators are making to their reports, and the changes that they're making to their physical examination procedures, and the changes that they're making to improve the content and quality of their QME reports, contributes to the realization of my lifelong goal. You know, if each of you viewing these video trainings make just a handful of changes to your QME reports, and your QME reports as a result start to improve, well, when we multiply that by the entire industry, thousands of doctors, we're seeing a major definite shift in the content and quality of the work that we do. So I'm so excited that you have an open mind. I'm so excited that you're receptive to this material. And I'm excited to continue with you over the next 3 weeks at least. We may even add a 5th week to this program. But I'm so excited to be with you, and I'm so excited to hear the feedback that you're sending me. And I'm so excited that this material is landing on fertile soil, which is the area between your 2 ears. So let's carry on. And before we get into today's material, I just want to refresh your memory as to what we talked about last week. Last week, we talked about the importance of clarity of your report, the importance of creating a customized template rather than using random text generator or report writing software. And we talked about how to at least begin to think about organizing your report into separate sections that we termed folders, because the human brain seems to store and retrieve information best just the same way that our computers do, and that is through the use of folders. And we're going to talk about which type of folders and how we name and categorize our folders in today's presentation. So just a couple of new topics and new general comments for today before we get into the required elements and the proper report formatting. As I said, over the past 7 days, I've spoken to many doctors. And I've had doctors send to me sample reports for my review. And I've reviewed these reports, and I've created what I call a 72-point checklist, 72 points. And those points are growing. I imagine in a couple days it'll be an 82-point and then a 92-point checklist, and who knows, it may even reach a 100-point checklist. But anyway, I've been reviewing doctors' reports, and there's a couple of important comments that I want to make before we progress with today's material. And these are critical comments and critical suggestions that I want you to listen very carefully to. You know, we as qualified medical evaluators are entering a period of increasing scrutiny and increasing discipline. And I'm going to share with you in August a new series on QME safety. QME safety. But before we get to that, I just want you to know that we are now exposed to increased scrutiny and increased discipline. It seems at the Division of Workers' Compensation Medical Unit, there is a new department and a new group of staff, a new group of lawyers whose sole function is to look for QME infractions and look for QME violations and to expose workers' compensation fraud as it passes through us, the qualified medical evaluators. So I want you to know that our reports and our work is coming under closer and more intense scrutiny than at any time in the past. And I'll talk about this completely in the month of August after we complete this series. So with that established, there's a couple of important key suggestions that I have that have come to the fore over the past 7 days as I've reviewed many doctors' reports. And the first comment that I want to make, and the first suggestion that I want to make has to do with your review of records. Now, review of records is one of the complexity factors. We've talked about this at great length before. Because the review of records is one of the complexity factors, it's my opinion and my recommendation to you that the review of records section of your report should be an absolute masterpiece, especially if you're going to invoke the review of records as a complexity factor. Now, the review of records complexity factor is very specific, and there are very specific criteria that are described in the labor code and in the codes of regulation that you must meet in order to have your review of records qualify as a complexity factor. So the review of records section of your report has to be perfect if you're going to use it as a complexity factor. Now, it's important that you do your own review of records. Let me say that again. It's important that you do your own review of records, especially if you're going to use review of records as a complexity factor. Now, many doctors have their review of records done for them by third-party staff or clerical staff or separate vendors who perform this function. I myself, I admit that in the past I've used third-party staff to prepare my review of records, but I discarded that procedure for the reasons that I'm going to share with you right now. Now, when you do your review of records, it's important that you do those yourself. Why is that? Well, the reason is that the labor code requires us to list and summarize all the information that we received from the parties, that we reviewed in preparation of the report, and that we relied on, keyword relied on, for the opinions and conclusions of the report. And many doctors simply receive a prepared review of records that they then review and incorporate or cut and paste into their report. And the information that they rely on, keyword rely, is simply prepared for them by a third-party clerical staff, perhaps in Pakistan. And in my opinion, this is unacceptable. You yourself as the doctor need to determine which information is important to you for the opinions and conclusions of your report. It's up to you to determine which of the information in the medical records you're going to rely on. And then you're required to disclose to the parties the information that you rely on. This cannot be done by a third-party clerical staff in Pakistan who are making $7 per hour. And I want you to imagine yourself in a deposition, or I want you to imagine your review of records complexity factor being challenged and having someone simply look at your review of records and asking you, "Doctor, did you prepare this review of records yourself? Is this the information that you relied upon?" And your response is simply, "Well, no, I had this prepared by a third party." And at the very least, let's just agree that that's not very impressive. It's not very persuasive, and it could lead to a lot of difficulties for you. So my suggestion is that you prepare your own review of records yourself. At the very least, you review the records, you read the records, and you highlight the information that's important to you. You can then have clerical staff then prepare the review of records section of your report, but they prepare it with the information that you've given them, that you rely on for the opinions and conclusions of your report. I recently read a doctor's report, and I went right to the review of records section because he used review of records as a complexity factor. And I could instantly tell that the review of records was done by a third party because it simply had stock text. It simply had nonsensical data input, and many times the recurring theme throughout the review of records was a recurring phrase that simply said, and this was a chiropractor's report, but it could just as easily be a psychology report or a pain management report or whatever. It simply said, "No pertinent information from a chiropractic standpoint." That was a recurring phrase. No pertinent information from a chiropractic standpoint. And I asked the doctor who prepared the review of records, and he said, "Well, it was prepared by a third party." And I asked him, "Are you telling me that a third party, a clerical staff with a 9th grade education somewhere perhaps in Botswana, determined in their wisdom and their education that there was no pertinent information from a chiropractic standpoint?" And he was quite chagrined to look at this review of records and admit that he simply accepted the review of records as it was prepared by a third party without any of his own editing, any of his own inputting, and it was quite awkward. And it's quite obvious. So the parties look at your review of records. Did you know that? The parties look at your review of records. Your review of records should be customized. It should be a masterpiece. It should be done by you. At least the information should be determined by you. And that should be plain for all parties who review your report to see. It should be plain for all parties to see. Okay? So that's a comment about review of records. Another comment is along the same lines. Always, always. How often? Always. Always prepare your own complexity factors. Never, never, never. How often? Never, never, never. Never let another person prepare your complexity factors for you. And this is an important comment for doctors who work for QME companies or QME groups. And I myself worked for 3 to 4 years for a large QME group in Sacramento. So I can tell you this principle this suggestion from my own personal experience, and it was reinforced to me just this week when I reviewed a doctor's report let me rephrase. I reviewed a doctor's report. This doctor works for a QME group, and much of the report is prepared for him by the QME group, including the complexity factors. So as I was reviewing the complexity factors and his description of his billing level, he billed an ML 104 level of billing. But by review of the complexity factors, he was only able to document 5.5 hours of complexity factors. And the complexity factors clearly state requires 6 or more of any 3 of the complexity factors: face-to-face time, review of records, and medical research. And he documented, 3.5 hours of face-to-face time and an hour and a half of review of records, and it only totaled up to 5 hours, and yet in his complexity factors he described 6 hours. And so he didn't qualify for the ML 104 level on that basis. Additionally, this doctor used the apportionment as one of the complexity factors. So as I saw apportionment as a complexity factor, I immediately went to that section in his report wherein he described apportionment, and in all actuality, there was no such section in his report. And so he was billing for an ML 104 level without substantiation of the appropriate and proper complexity factors. And when I discussed this with him, he said, well, that was prepared for me by the QME group. And I asked the doctor, well, who signs the report? And he said, I do. And the point is, if you're going to send the report out with your signature on it, make sure that the complexity factors are accurate and are proper, because when trouble comes calling, it's you that signed the report, and it's you that are going to have to answer for any discrepancies and or inconsistencies. So always prepare your own complexity factors. It's okay to work in a QME group, it's okay, but always prepare the billing yourself to ensure that it's proper, that it's accurate, and that you're comfortable responding to inquiries about your billing level. Okay? Okay. The next comment that I want to make, I'll just touch upon briefly because I have an entire section devoted to this in next week's program. Has to do with bias language. Bias language. And here's a general principle. Anytime you read any written word, whether it be an article in a magazine, a study in a journal, a QME report, what have you, anytime you read something written, you always want to ask yourself, what is the motive of the author? And authors have many motives. Sometimes the motive is simply to entertain. Sometimes the motive is simply to inform. Sometimes the motive is to educate. Sometimes the motive is to persuade. Authors have many different motives for their writing. You can also ask yourself this when you watch TV, when you watch documentaries, when you watch the news. Always ask yourself, what is the motive of the author? And many times the motive is clear, many times the motive is subtle. So that raises the question for us as qualified medical evaluators, what should our motive be? What should our motive be? And I've read some reports over the past week where the motive was suspect. suspect. And so the comment that I want to share with you today, and I have an entire segment planned for this next week, the topic that I want to share with you today has to do with bias language. Bias language. You want to remove all hints of bias language from your report, because as a qualified medical evaluator, there's a perception in the industry and there's an obligation that we have to be objective. And while it's difficult many times to be completely objective, and we all agree on this, we want to remove any hint of bias language from our report, because bias language sticks out like a sore thumb, and your motive sticks out like a sore thumb. So our motive determines our language, and our motive is simply to be an impartial and independent and objective evaluator, and that should be reflective in our language. Okay? And then the final comment I want to share with you before we get into today's material has to do with your report writing. And as an example of this, let me talk to you about symptom questionnaires. And the general principle that I want to introduce here, of which symptom questionnaires is just an example, but the general principle is that when you're preparing your QME reports, such as the history, such as the relevant medical history, such as descriptions of symptom questionnaires, which we'll talk about, it's not necessary to reproduce in your report entire documents that you receive in the form of medical records. So let me clarify that a little bit. I've read some reports over the past 7 days wherein doctors reproduce entire documents within the body of their report. And reports can become extremely lengthy as a result of simply reproducing the documents and inputting those documents within the body of your own report. So as an example, if you're reviewing a primary treating physician's progress report, a PR2 report, it's not necessary to input every piece of information from that document into your report. It's not even necessary to reproduce any of it if that document does not contain salient information, pertinent information that affects your opinions or conclusions, or that's pertinent to the unfolding of the case as it happened in chronologic order. Some doctors are reproducing the entirety of that document in the body of their report. Similarly, with symptom questionnaires, some doctors, in describing the results of symptom questionnaires, are reproducing entirely the entire document and every single response from the document into their QME report. And this is not necessary. These are tools and instruments, and the medical records are tools and instruments for us that we use in fashioning our opinions and conclusions. So with regards to symptom questionnaires, with symptom questionnaires, you can simply summarize the symptom questionnaire. You can summarize the end result of the symptom questionnaire. For example, on a revised Oswestry low back disability questionnaire, you can simply provide the score, the sum total score of the questionnaire, and then provide a reader a little interpretation as to what that score means. For example, higher scores are indicative of greater impact of the lower back pain condition on the ability to complete activities of daily living. Mrs. Jones scored 35. 35 is equivalent to a moderate disability of the lumbar spine. It's not necessary to reproduce every single response of every single symptom questionnaire within the body of your report. In fact, to do so is unnecessary and is obnoxious. It's obnoxious. It's not necessary. And it's simply taking up unnecessary pages, and it takes up unnecessary time for the reader of your report, which are the claims administrators, applicant attorneys, defense attorneys, the raters, perhaps a workers' compensation judge. They simply need to get to the point and to reproduce the entirety of documents is not necessary. So just provide a summary of the salient points and salient features as to how those symptom questionnaires impact you and your opinions and conclusions. Okay, so there's a couple of new suggestions that have been gleaned over the past 7 days through the review of dozens of doctors' reports. For now, I want to go down to the computer, and we're going to go over a PowerPoint presentation wherein we discuss the required elements. And this is going to be a fascinating and invaluable exercise for us, because we're going to get to the final bottom line, the common final bottom line, wherein we all agree about what elements are required in a QME report, what elements are superfluous and unnecessary. And in this way, we're all going to systematize and standardize to some extent our QME reports to make sure that our reports contain everything that's necessary for the parties and contain nothing more than is necessary for the parties. So let's go on down to the computer now. And for now, I want you to stay with me through part 2. For next week, we're going to go into the proper report formatting of the physical exam. And then in part 4 of this series, we're going to talk about substantial medical evidence. And as I said, we may even have part 5 of this program. So for now, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. Look forward to being with you for the remainder of this program, and also next week as we continue our 4-part series on QME Report Writing Mastery. Okay, so let's get into the remainder of this program and talk about QME report writing. And our references for this section of the report are going to include the 2001 Physician's Guide and the AMA Guides 5th edition. And what we're going to talk about in this section of the report is how to put your report together so that it's a beautiful work product, and so that it represents you and it represents your hard work and it represents you well. It presents you as a competent and a qualified medical evaluator. And I use the word qualified there differently than what we're accustomed to using it in reference to a qualified medical evaluation. It means that you're qualified, it means that you're competent, it means that you're clear, it means that you're accurate, it means that you're precise, and it shows that you put some thought and it puts some effort into your report. And as I said earlier on in this program, our reports many times outlive us and outlive the case. And you'll never know where your report's going to end up. So you want it to be perfect. Now, I know it's often very difficult, if not impossible, to create a perfect report, meaning not even one single typo. But really, that should be our driving goal, is to create reports that are as close to perfect as possible. And I have many, many practical suggestions for you on just how to do that in this section. So we're going to start by talking about the 2001 Physician's Guide. And we'll talk about the required elements that were required of us in our QME report writing prior to 2005, when we adopted the AMA Guides 5th edition. Now, at the time of the recording of this program, which is in 2015, we still occasionally have instances wherein we utilize the 2001 Physician's Guides.
But by and large now, we've mostly moved out of the 2001 Physician's Guide and out of the permanent disability rating schedule described in that guide. And we're now almost universally involved with permanent impairment evaluations as those are described in the AMA Guide's 5th edition. But the 2001 Physician's Guide still contains many valuable concepts, many valuable ideas, and many valuable elements that we still rely on because the AMA Guide's 5th edition was not specifically written for the workers' compensation system. It's not ideally adapted to the workers' compensation system, especially here in California. So the 2001 Physician's Guide is still a valuable reference, and I'll share with you some of its important and valuable concepts here as we go. So I wonder how many of you have the 2001 Physician's Guide. I have it here for you on screen, and you can see that this is the 3rd edition in 2001. And this is what's called the Physician's Guide. Many of you are familiar with this, but if you're not, this is the Bible that we used to describe the procedures involved with the qualified medical evaluation prior to 2005. So the 2001 Physician's Guide and the Physician's Guide in general has a much longer history in the California workers' compensation system than does the AMA Guides. And as I said, this was our Bible, or our set of Bibles, since we had multiple editions. These were our Bibles to govern the QME process prior to 2005. So I want to share with you some of the important concepts that the 2001 Physician's Guide required back in the day that we include in our QME report, some of which are still going to apply. And I'll show you how we integrate the elements that are required in the 2001 Physician's Guide with our current permanent impairment evaluations that we do based upon the AMA Guides. So what we're going to do with the 2001 Physician's Guide is we're going to go into chapter 5 and talk about the role of physicians in the workers' compensation system. And we're going to go right to the medical legal reports in chapter 6, writing medical legal reports on pages 99. And then we'll go and talk about some other descriptions on page 110. Okay, so let's dive right into the 2001 Physician's Guide, and we'll return here shortly. Okay, so the 2001 Physician's Guide gives us some guidelines as to what are the elements that are required to produce a well-written or otherwise ratable report. And we'll refer back to the 2001 Physician's Guide itself in just a couple minutes, but for our purposes now, I just want to list out for you in numeric format what it is that the 2001 Physician's Guide required. So item number 1 is they required that we have a section of our report that contained the identifying information. In other words, the demographic information about the injured worker, the insurance company, any attorneys involved, etc. And we'll elaborate more on identifying information here as we go. It required that we have an opening statement. It required that we list our sources of information. We refer to this now as our review of records, and I'll show you how we handle the review of records and how we list our sources of information. They required that we can have a section in our report describe the history of the present illness or injury. They required that we list and describe the present complaints and or present symptom. They required that we have an elaborate and extensive history section that included, number 1, the social history, the review of systems, and any related or relevant medical information. Required that we have a section in our report describing the results of our physical examination, a section on the diagnosis of the current condition, a section describing the causation of the disability in those cases where disability was present, a statement as to whether or not the examinee had arrived at a permanent and stationary condition. It required that we have a section in our report where we describe the factors of disability. Now, for injuries after 1105, we no longer describe factors of disability. Rather, we describe permanent impairments. But back in the day, it used to be called factors of disability. And we're going to see that in our new hybrid style of reporting, we're also going to have this section. But for injuries after 1105, we're going to describe that the permanent impairment section of our report. The 2001 Physician's Guide required that we have a section in our report wherein we discuss the apportionment of the permanent disability. They required that we have a section wherein we describe the current medical treatment needed, if any, the future medical treatment that would be necessary to cure and or relieve from the effects of the industrial injury. Number 15, the reasons for our opinion. And isn't that interesting? This sort of coincides with our discussion on substantial medical evidence, wherein we provided the how and why we arrived at our opinions and conclusions. So even back prior to 1105, the 2001 Physician's Guide required that we have a statement as to the reasons for our opinion, and they required that it not simply be a templated, regurgitated script, that we actually describe the specific citations and the specific passages in the medical records and the specific reasons based on the physical examination and all the collective reasons that contributed to the opinions and conclusions. And the 2001 Physician's Guide finally required that we provide a disclosure whether or not other individuals were involved in the evaluation, and several other different types of disclosures. And we'll review those disclosures in just a minute. And I just want to ask, for those of you that have been doing qualified medical evaluations for any length of time, meaning before 1105, how many of you are using this format, whether in its entirety or whether or not you're using parts of this format? And my guess is that if you've been doing QME reports for any length of time, your current reports probably still retain some of these elements that are described in the 2001 Physician's Guide, and there's good reason for that. And as I said earlier, it's because the AMA Guide's 5th edition was not designed to be adapted to the California workers' compensation system. Rather, it's designed to provide for permanent impairment evaluations in many jurisdictions, and it wasn't specifically designed for workers' compensation situations specifically, whereas the 2001's Physician's Guide was. And so many of these elements that are required in California workers' compensation are not discussed in the AMA guides, and so we retain many of these elements into our current report writing, even though we're not currently describing permanent disability, but rather we're describing permanent impairment. Okay, so let's go back now to the 2001 Physician's Guide, and let's go to the section in Chapter 6 described as the required elements on page 103. So let's scroll down there to page 103. Okay, and this is, well, actually this begins on page 99. Okay, so we're here in the section of the 2001 Physician's Guide talking about writing the medical legal report, and we're going to talk about the required elements that are described in this text. So we're on to the required elements. Okay, so the AMA, this is the 2001 Physician's Guide. They talk about including identifying information. They talk about an opening statement. And let's just go over a couple of these to describe some of these elements that may not be described in the AMA guides. So with identifying information, it says that the heading of the report should provide the information necessary to identify the report, including the date of the report, the name of the applicant, the date of injury, the claim number, the Workers' Compensation Appeals Board number when possible, and any other information necessary for clarity to the parties. So, for example, the name and address of the claims administrator, the name and address of the applicant attorney, the name and address of the defense attorney, perhaps a picture of the examinee to identify the examinee as an actual person. All of that is included in the identifying information. I'm going to show you examples of how this would look in your QME report here in just a couple moments. Your report should include an opening statement. This section should provide information on the context of the report and the performance of the examination. In this section, you're required to provide the date, the place, and the duration of the exam. You're required to describe the actual time spent face-to-face by the physician with the injured worker. Face-to-face time includes the time in which the evaluator takes the history, performs a physical examination, or discusses the worker's medical condition with the worker. Face-to-face time does not include time spent in the performance of diagnostic or laboratory tests, such as blood tests or x-rays, or time spent on records review or report writing. And I'll show you how to construct an opening statement that complies with all of these requirements, including describing the face-to-face time and in describing the time spent on review of records. Okay, the report should contain a section that describes the sources of information. This section should contain a list of all the medical records that were reviewed in the preparation of the report. You must also record any non-medical information and its source that was received from either party and reviewed in preparing your report or in formulating your opinion. You should list the names of anyone other than the patient who was interviewed or with whom the case was discussed. And nowadays we refer to this as our review of records section. And it's interesting because the review of records section in our report actually is governed by several labor codes and several codes of regulation. And I'll show you how to construct the review of records section of your report so that it complies with all of those requirements and also complies with the requirements as described here in the 2001 Physician's Guide. The report must have a section describe the history of the present injury or illness. And this is the injury or illness that is the subject of the workers' compensation claim. So let's just read some of these requirements. The report must include a comprehensive and factual account of the industrial exposure, the applicant's complaints, and the treatment the applicant has received. And I talked earlier in the program about an efficient and effective way to do this. The nature of the claim will determine how extensive this history must be. Injuries resulting from cumulative trauma or occupational illnesses will require a detailed explanation of the applicant's job duties, the conditions of the injurious exposures, including the approximate time spent on the tasks in question, and the temporal relationship between the exposure and the symptoms. The history for a specific injury should describe the activity that immediately preceded the accident and how the accident occurred. And we refer to this, and let's create a footnote right here. We refer to this is what's called the mechanism of injury. Mechanism of injury. And you should spend extensive time in determining the mechanism of the injury, because it's the mechanism of injury that you're going to rely on later on in your report when it comes time to provide opinions and conclusions, especially on the causation and apportionment of the permanent impairment. So mental note here that extra emphasis is placed upon the activity that immediately preceded the accident and how the accident occurred. We refer to that as the mechanism of injury. So they elaborate on that here in the 2001 Physician's Guide. They say that whenever possible, you should provide relevant details such as the approximate weights of objects, the worker's position while performing the task, the height of a fall, and all specific and detailed information that fully elaborates on the mechanism of injury. Your report should describe what happened after the injury. Were they transported by ambulance to a hospital? Did they continue working? In other words, in the history section, you describe the history of the injury, the history of the medical treatment, the history of the symptoms from onset, meaning from the date of the injury, all the way up to present time, immediately preceding the date of your evaluation. Finally, if there is more than one injury, the report should clearly describe each injury and the subsequent treatment or changes in treatment if treatment was ongoing at the time of the second injury. Your report must list a section that details the present complaints, or we might title this, instead of present complaints, we might title this present symptoms. Present symptoms, I think, is a more neutral and politically correct term. So in this section, you should explain the patient's current symptoms. You should attempt to relate the frequency, duration, and intensity of the complaints to specific activities and note temporal patterns, such as stiffness in the morning or pain that increases throughout the day. Pain that interferes with activity is a rateable disability in workers' compensation, so it's important that the report give a clear understanding of the extent of any limitations. Now, this is specifically referring to injuries prior to 1/1/2005, when we had different descriptions for pain than what we use with the AMA guides. Now, this statement is somewhat correct in referring to the 2005 AMA Guides 5th edition, because pain we can provide for permanent impairment due to the added burden of pain in Chapter 18 of the AMA Guides. So, regardless of the date of injury, it's important that we provide very specific and clear descriptions of the pain, because regardless of the date of injury, it's possible that the examinee could qualify for either permanent disability and or additional permanent impairment due to any pain that they may be experiencing. Okay, so that's the history section. I'm sorry, that's the present complaints section. Then in a separate section, entitled History, this section should summarize important medical events or conditions that may have bearing on the applicant's injury. We might refer to this as the relevant medical history in order to distinguish it from the history of the present injury or illness. So in this section, we would have also a social history, we would have a review of systems, and any other relevant medical information. This is where you would question the applicant about any pre-existing injuries or conditions in the affected part of the body that is the subject of the workers' compensation claim. And earlier in the program, I gave you some suggestions as to how to elicit the relevant medical history. Okay, next section is the physical examination and the findings of the physical examination. Now, of course, this is the main body of the QME report. And this is the section of the QME report over which we as doctors have absolute domain. The physical examination section of our report is the section where we shine as the medical evaluator. So it's my opinion, and I stated this earlier in the program, that your physical examination section of your report should be a masterpiece. It should be clear. It should be precise. It should show exact measurements that are formatted in charts and tables and with bullet points. And it should be clear to non-medical readers. Now, for dates of injury prior to 1/105, we used a different Bible for our guidance on the physical examination. We used the Evaluation of Industrial Disability by Packard-Thurber. We no longer use that. We now use the AMA Guides 5th edition. And they specifically stated prior to 1/105 that you should not use the AMA Guides because the AMA Guides outlines different measurement techniques than those used in California, although California has now adopted the measurement techniques described in the AMA Guides. But if you're evaluating dates of injury prior to 1/105 and you're required to use the 1997 Permanent Disability Rating Schedule rather than the AMA Guides, you will need to be familiar with the measuring guidelines described in Packard-Thurber. Describe the purpose of clinical tests rather than referring to the test only by name. So don't list the findings of tests by, for example, Kemp's test was positive. You would not say that. You would not say that Milgram's test was negative. You would describe the purpose of the test. For example, Kemp's test is a test that has as its purpose to load and test the intervertebral facets, joints of the spine. So, for example, you might say facet compression test. Facet compression test was negative. Or sciatic nerve stretch test was negative, rather than using the term Lasag's test. And so, in other words, describe the purpose of clinical tests rather than referring to the tests by name. Now, it says that in this section, if you have performed or reviewed any diagnostic tests, such as X-rays or EMG, you should summarize the findings in this section. We're going to see that when we create our hybrid format of QME Report, we're going to have a separate section specifically for diagnostic tests, because I'm sure you'll agree with me that most times by the time the examinee gets to the qualified medical evaluation, they've had many types and even repeat diagnostic testing, including X-rays, MRIs, CT scans, electrodiagnostic studies, perhaps ultrasounds, and all these different types of studies, arthrograms and myelograms. And so the diagnostic studies we're going to separate out and isolate in their own specific section to make it easy for the reader to locate and to summarize the results of all the diagnostic studies. Next, we include a section entitled the diagnosis, and this is where you give a specific diagnosis for each and every condition you are evaluating. And with regards to the AMA Guides 5th edition, I'll give you some suggestions as to how to fashion your diagnosis so that your diagnosis aligns and coincides with your description of the permanent impairment. You should have a section that describes the cause of the disability. We might refer to this in our report as the causation section. So let's call this causation section of the report. Okay. This section addresses the relationship between the conditions you found on examination and the injury or occupational exposure. In some situations, this section can be quite brief. More detailed discussions is required in cumulative trauma cases, occupational illnesses, stress claims, or in cases where additional body parts or systems have become affected since the original injury, and this happens all the time in the current climate of the QME evaluation. We're seeing the addition of psychologic injury, and we're seeing the addition of additional body parts or systems in addition to the principal injuries. So the causation section, at least in the current environment, is a section that has the potential to become quite lengthy and quite complex. And for that reason, the causation of the disability or the causation of the permanent impairment qualifies as one of the complexity factors under CCR 9795 and allows for a higher level of complexity of the report and a higher level of billing for the report when the report qualifies as a complex report. So it's my opinion that the causation section of your report is something that you should be very familiar with. Be very familiar with working in this section. You should be very familiar with describing the causation of the disability, and this is a section of your report that you're going to want to be a masterpiece. You're going to want it to be very thorough and very accurate, and you're going to want your opinions on causation of the disability to qualify as substantial medical evidence. Okay, so this important section of the report should include an opinion on or a section on the permanent and stationary status. And it's interesting, it says that in this section you should state whether or not you have determined the patient's condition to be permanent and stationary, along with the reasons for this determination. Isn't that interesting that we have inferences and implications? I guess this would be an implication as to substantial medical evidence all the way back here in the 2001 Physician's Guide. And isn't that exactly what they're asking? They're asking us to explain the how and the why we feel that the examinee may have reached a permanent and stationary condition, or if the examinee has not reached a permanent and stationary condition, explain the reasons why. Why are they not permanent and stationary? And explain your reasons in a clear and well-formatted fashion. And I suggest the use of listed bullet points so that the reader of your report can clearly see each of the reasons as to why you arrived at your conclusion. The report should contain a section entitled The Factors of Disability, wherein you describe the subjective factors, the objective factors, the work restrictions, and the estimate of loss of pre-injury capacity. This, of course, relates to injuries before 1105. And in our current reports related to the AMA guides, we're going to title this section Permanent Impairment. Okay, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a couple minutes when we get into the AMA guides. Your report should contain a section on the apportionment of the disability, and we're going to sort of hybridize this as well to coincide also with our causation section for injuries after 1105. But it's important to remind ourselves that apportionment of the disability describes the degree to which any permanent disability is due to pre-existing conditions or underlying disease. Apportionment applies only to permanent disability. Apportionment does not apply to medical treatment. It does not apply to any of the other benefits associated with workers' compensation. It only applies to the benefits related to permanent disability. And we'll talk more about some current ideas related to the apportionment of permanent impairment to causation when we get in our discussion of the AMA guides. Okay, and then just a couple of more sections. We should have a section of our report entitled the medical treatment that's now needed to cure or relieve the effects of the industrial injury. That is when you feel that the examinee is not at permanent and stationary condition or has not yet reached maximum medical improvement. If the examinee is at a permanent and stationary condition and you provide for a permanent impairment or permanent disability factors, or a permanent impairment rating, I should say, there needs to be a section in your report entitled the future medical care or future medical treatment. This is where you elaborate what type of treatment could be necessary to cure or relieve the effects of the industrial injury, or to cure or relieve any flare-ups or exacerbations as they may arise. And then finally, after all of that is done, there's still some work that needs to be done. You need to have a section in your report wherein you describe the reasons for your opinion. And here it's so fascinating. It says that for each opinion, you must provide a clear description of why you have reached that opinion. You should also provide explanation